All right, I hope you're ready, because if you're not, too bad. Buckle up. We're going to talk about Laura Mulvey's essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, and the way that it gives us a new way of thinking and talking about the way that gender and the motion picture collide, or maybe more accurately, the way that the motion picture in classic Hollywood has been a machine for solidifying and prolonging patriarchy in not just cinema, but in the minds of all who view it. So Laura Mulvey's essay that appears in 1975, it's hard to understate the impact that it has on the field of film studies. It essentially defines a whole field, or maybe even a couple of fields of film studies. Most primarily, she kicks the door open for psychoanalytic film theory, right? Scholars who can perform Freudian or Lacanian readings of movies, and also how she uses that to push forward feminist film theory as well. And these all work together to give us some pretty phenomenal readings of the films of Alfred Hitchcock along these lines. There's an entire book called Everything I Always Wanted to Know About Lacan, but was afraid to ask Hitchcock, that does things like this. And then there's the psychoanalytic feminist set of essays, The Women Who Knew Too Much, that examines Hitchcock as well. These are all in the shadow of Mulvey, as is the critical study of film noir, because film noir really comes into its own as an academic subject of study in the 1970s, in part because of the work of Mulvey and other feminist film theorists at the time who were applying all of these ideas to those 1940s and 50s Hollywood movies. She also coins a phrase, the male gaze, that winds up becoming part of the cultural conversation more broadly, where people who have not even read Mulvey's essay know what that means and know how to use it and talk about it. That's a huge lasting impact. It's also an exportable idea where we can talk about the multiple kinds of gazes that marginalized or oppressed groups are subjected to, and a lot of that is coming from Mulvey giving us the language to talk about that and the ways of understanding that. So let's talk about this original essay, right? The one that starts it all. So Mulvey begins the essay by laying out some pretty basic. Now we would consider them basic. At the time, they're kind of groundbreaking understandings about the effect that movies have on public perception of things. And we are familiar with this a little bit from our study of Walter Benjamin, but the basic thing is that film is going to convey commonly held beliefs and assumptions about power and gender relationships in society. That's not to say that it is doing it consciously, although it could be. But it's to say that because these are visual and dramatic representations of our world coming from people who live in that world, it is by default perhaps going to unconsciously embody some of the prevailing ideas and beliefs about all sorts of things that comes in from the writers and directors and cinematographers and so on of the movie, right? They can't help but express the commonly held cultural beliefs of their time. These are mass commercial products that kind of have to tap into that. And so we are able to look at movies to kind of understand what large groups of people kind of commonly hold to be true or to be normal, I guess might be the better way to put it. And as a result, Mulvey says we can look at classical Hollywood cinema and very easily determine that what we consider erotic and visually pleasurable in American film society is also the language of the dominant patriarchal order. That that the erotic is defined by patriarchy. And that, essentially all of film's presentations of desire and pleasure are distinctly male or are geared toward pleasing men. This, of course, is very hard to dismiss. As bold of a claim as it might sound, it's hard to dismiss when you consider that nearly all of the directors and cinematographers of the era that she's talking about are men and are pretty much all white men. So we are when we are getting what we are supposed to view as attractive, we are going to see what a straight white man at the time is going to view as attractive and communicate that to others as far as what attractive is, which then defines what others view as attractive, and so on. And Mulvey is hoping to outline this and how it works in her essay as a means of challenging its dominance. And then, she concludes the essay hoping for an alternative cinema that in some ways has yet to break out of academia. Hello. Yes. Okay. Till 4. Okay. I will see you soon. Thank you. Bye. So let's take a look at section A here. This section, the first piece of it, has a really good overview of different Freudian readings of gender, all of which kind of boils down to her use of Freud's castration complex, that this is threatening to men. They view the woman as a threat to their masculinity, as sort of their other, right? Their opposite, the not man, whose absence of a phallus makes them very nervous about their own phallus, or the possibility that she will take their phallus from them to give her what she lacks, right? This kind of stuff. I know it sounds a little out there, but this is, we've got to run with it to run with the other things that Mulvey is talking about. The big thing here is that lack is simultaneously something used to view women as weak, and the lack of a penis is also something that makes them threatening, because it's something that the male does not understand or does not know how to define or deal with, right? Now, what the big idea that this all comes down to is that in this sort of narrative order, men are portrayed as the makers of meaning, right? The ones who go out and sort of impose order, define things, investigate the mysteries, where women in this are the bearers of meaning, right? The keepers of the secrets, the mysteries, the things to be solved, the chaos to be ordered, and so on. And so that's kind of a basic Freudian male-female dynamic that Mulvey sees as playing out in conventional Hollywood cinema. Now, section B is when she really gets into kind of laying out her readings of not just how these stories work, but basically the fundamental appeals of cinema itself. And so cinema derives from the pleasures of cinema are twofold. On the one hand, it appeals to our love of seeing something being put on strictly for our entertainment, right? Like, we love to have shows put on for us. That's scopophilia, right? The joy of looking. And what movies give us that we love even more is the idea of spying on a private world. So we really love, or if we really love movies, there's a certain level of voyeurism in us. And what we love about the movies is we love having a show put on for us where the performers pretend not to know that we're watching them. And Mulvey calls this the illusion of voyeuristic separation. And this is the essence of the gaze, right? Is that the looker who is there to be pleased is typically male, because the makers are male and they're pleasing themselves, right? Or they're kind of projecting their own desires onto the audience. And so here with movies, what this allows us to do when we go to a movie, this sort of interplay between scopophilia and voyeurism, is it allows us to repress our desire to be seen. And because we're individuals, we want people to notice us, not when we're spying on them, though. And so that's where this happens, right? So we can go to the movies and sort of repress that desire to be seen by projecting our desires onto the screen, which is going to depict an idealized image of ourselves, right? The movie star. So I can go into a movie and sort of forget about my need to be seen as a really cool, wonderful individual because George Clooney's in the movie. And I can sort of project all of my desires to be cool and charismatic onto George Clooney, who is cooler and more charismatic than I'll ever be. And so I'm sort of getting pleased every which way that I'm looking for. And this, of course, this idealized image of self is not me. It's a misrepresentation or a misrecognition, which connects to Lacan's mirror stage in child development. But essentially, it allows us to lose our sense of ego and have it reinforced for us at the same time, which is like what the star system taps into, where we can go to a movie and identify with what's being depicted, right? Really sort of immerse ourselves in that character or identify with that actor while at the same time being removed from the situation. They're never going to turn to us and say, stop looking at me. And so we're able to fully embrace and project our desires onto this. So of course we love looking at the movies because we're removed from them, but we also identify with it and love looking at it because it's a show being put on for us. That's brilliant, right? This is the whole, like Mulvey's basically outlining the whole reason about why we like going to the movies on a psychological level. But there's a problem with this idealized depiction of desire in that it pretty much always, at least in classic Hollywood cinema, and it revolves around the objectification of women, the othering of women, and then if we want to extend this, the demonizing of sort of people of color and other foreigners, etc. Like that's it all kind of is wrapped up in here together. But Mulvey's keeping the focus here on visual pleasure as it applies to gender rather than race, and others later are able to make Mulvey's critique more intersectional to show how this gaze is not just male but also straight and white and so on. And abled, of course, as well. But where she's looking at it here for starters is that, women are the object of the man's gaze in the movie and a source of pleasure and desire, but are also portrayed as threatening, right? Mysteries that need to be solved, problems that need to be solved, something that needs to be explained or answered. And who's going to do the explaining, the answering, the solving, the ordering? The male protagonist. And in turn, as a result, the spectator as well. So it's reinforcing a patriarchal need for order and knowledge and all of that in the real world. So we're not going to the movies to escape. We're basically going to the movies, she's saying, to kind of experience a more coherent and successful version of what patriarchy is trying to enact in the world. So let's take a look at this then. Essentially, the men are there to look, the women are there to be looked at. Right, active subjects versus passive objects. And this is where spectacle and narrative merge in movies, in that the actresses in movies and the characters as written are styled and behave in a manner to court the male gaze, right? To be looked at is the purpose of a woman in classical Hollywood cinema, or at least the female leads in the movies. Saying the romantic lead, it's basically the same thing, right? That's the function in the story, as the Western director Bud Boetticher in Mulvey's essay so coarsely puts it, right? She's there to inspire the hero. That's it, right? There to be looked at, a treasure to be won, right? Something to be taken possession of, and so on. So she's the love object for the protagonist, which then, because the protagonist is identifying with because the spectator is identifying with the protagonist, that then means that she is an object of desire for the spectator as well. And so what we get then is women in these things are never advancing the story. In fact, their arrival usually is halting the main storyline. You see this in so many classical Hollywood movies where the woman is introduced singing a song in a nightclub. It does nothing to move the story forward. Everything stops for the hero to look at the woman singing and be entranced by her. And the camera is going to linger over her and perhaps even photograph her in such a way that she is separated from real three-dimensional time and space from the rest of the characters and the rest of the world of the movie. Almost as though the movie departs from reality and goes into pure fantasy where everything's in soft focus and the woman is not even a full coherent subject, but is rather a collection of body parts photographed in close-up and lingered over like that. I mean, you're looking at like a literal dissection of a woman there as a removal from three-dimensional space, being reduced to a two-dimensional object that's not even a coherent whole, right? But just an assemblage of pieces. And so this, different movies will handle this in different ways, but you can see it all over the place in classic Hollywood cinema. And so what this means then is that the woman's role in the movie is to be pursued and possessed, and the viewer possesses her vicariously as well at the end, which makes the male hero and the male spectator feel omnipotent. Right, this is part of the pleasure of classic Hollywood cinema that it's presenting to men, is the going on the adventure and getting the girl and taking possession, right? Having another trophy at the end of the movie, right? That kind of stuff. It's all there to reinforce that patriarchal need for omnipotence and control and order. But there's a problem, right? Women are also threatening in this case because men don't actually understand them, because they're not viewing them as subjects, but rather as objects, and not all of and they're not willing to be treated as objects. And so there is that kind of danger and threat and mystery lurking in these characters. And so some movies are going to sort of structure their narratives around this to make it about ways of neutralizing the threat that women present, so that the protagonist and the spectator can take possession of her. Because they're not going to take possession of her as a threatening figure, but she will have to be explained, neutralized, domesticated, whatever the word we would want to use for it is, because her sexual difference is so threatening. She's got to be brought under the control of the man. And there's various ways that films do this. On the one hand, one approach is that the storyline will have the protagonist make the female character reenact some original trauma that he's trying to work out. This will demystify the character and by punishing her or saving her at the same time. This is sadism, right? That it turned into a dramatic arc that the storyline would, of course, validate and promote through its favorable depiction. This is the storyline of a movie like Rear Window, where you see Jimmy Stewart's character wanting to make his socialite fiancée Grace Kelly be more like the kind of woman he wants her to be, and the storyline kind of involves him putting her into a scenario that puts her life in danger, and but is also sort of initiating her into his world of adventure that we get there. The other version is going to be turning the woman figure into a passive fetish object, which is where we get that kind of purely erotic, not bound by space and time kind of stuff that you might see in presentations of someone like Marlene Dietrich or Rita Hayworth or Marilyn Monroe, right? It's all about kind of fetishizing clothing, body parts, etc., and photographing the actress in such a way that she is not part of the real world, but is rather kind of only exists when the man's looking at her, and is often being made to being styled not to who she is, but to a certain male ideal. Mulvey calls this fetishistic scopophilia, essentially rendering the woman into a fetish object that the male can just sort of endlessly delight in and look at, reducing her to a two-dimensional image. This is the plot of Vertigo, where Vertigo is really a combination of both, but Hitchcock's Vertigo essentially is a real-time dramatization of these processes to neutralize the threat that women represent. In this kind of purely erotic version of fetishistic scopophilia that we get, sometimes the male protagonist will even disappear from the shots altogether, and it's just the spectator and the female fetish object in direct erotic rapport with each other, and so like basically cutting out the middleman and allowing the male spectator to ogle uninhibited by plot or anything like that. In this case, the woman is no longer real. She is just a pure image. This is very often how Marilyn Monroe is is photographed. Either way, women in these movies remain passive, controlled objects of the male gaze. We see Hitchcock kind of play into this and play against it in his films. And we'll see that. We saw that in Psycho. We see it in lots of his other films where he shows the authority figure kind of sadistically controlling the woman, but only will do it after the audience has identified with that male sadist. And this is what he does in the films that star Jimmy Stewart. He uses Jimmy Stewart's likability to kind of get us to be like, oh God, I love Jimmy Stewart. Yeah, I'm rooting for him. And then as you watch the movie, you slowly realize that this guy's the biggest creep in the history of motion pictures, and whoops, too late, you've already identified with him. Now you are complicit in everything that he's doing. And that's kind of where Mulvey goes to here as well, is that as consumers of classic Hollywood cinema, to some degree, the viewer has been made complicit in perpetuating and sustaining this patriarchal order simply because of the pleasure of looking. And so we're stuck. Right? This is like what we talked about when we were back at the beginning of the semester dealing with D.W. Griffith. So much of the language of movies is built upon this kind of sexist and sadistic way of treating people like objects. It's the visual language of fashion, of glamour, of all sorts of things. How do we get out of it? Are we screwed? Is there any way to photograph people in movies that don't tap into this stuff that Mulvey's talking about? Is the medium itself, is the art form tainted by the patriarchal order? Or is there a way out? Is there a gaze in cinema that is not male? These are the things that filmmakers now and theorists now are very much like actively wrestling with. But it's thanks to what Mulvey starts with. And where she starts with, or what she calls for at the end of her essay as the solution, is what she calls passionate detachment. For Mulvey, that is the way that movies could be photographed that would sort of circumvent or short circuit this male gaze. And the big question that I would have for you as we pair this with a movie that comes out the same year, Chantal Akerman's Jeanne Dielman, is Dielman an example of the cinema that Mulvey is calling for? Is Jeanne Dielman a movie of passionate detachment? Does Jeanne Dielman subvert or at least get rid of the male gaze and replace it with something that is not objectifying? Those are the questions, but that's the question that we always have to ask ourselves now with any work of cinema that we look at, thanks to Mulvey. To what degree is this image perpetuating the male gaze? To what degree is this work of art perpetuating patriarchy? Or how can this tool that has almost a century worth of language hardwired to sort of reinforce the erotic order of patriarchy, to what degree can that tool be amended or be adapted to a less oppressive gaze?